Ferguson, Missouri. We've got some business to take care of. Ooh. Ferguson, Missouri. All before Mike Brown, because everybody will remember Mike Brown and what tragically occurred with that situation in Ferguson. But you know what they want to sweep under the rug, Ferguson, that I'm not going to allow them to do? Is the fact that long before Mike Brown, Ferguson was a city, a community, under occupation. Under occupation. I want to stress that word, occupation. The residents of Ferguson had long been complaining that they were being picked on unfairly. And this was true. The mostly majority African American community of Ferguson speeding and traffic tickets were handed out like candy in Ferguson. Racial profiling was a thing that people in Ferguson had come to expect as a normal occurrence, like turning on a light switch in your home. Everyone in Ferguson knew that they were under occupation. And then when Mike Brown, that situation happened, when he was shot and murdered, unarmed, that's when the whole powder keg of all the issues in Ferguson that had been happening for decades, that's when the powder keg exploded in Ferguson. Now, conservatives in this country tried to pretend as though they didn't know why the residents of Ferguson were so upset about Mike Brown. They had done no research about what was happening in the community of Ferguson. White conservatives ran to Ferguson to portray a narrative of residents of Ferguson who were violent, hated law enforcement, were radical Marxist socialists. You know, the same old usual shit. The things they would later go and try to portray and do in Minneapolis after George Floyd, in Louisville after Breonna Taylor. It's the same playbook with white conservatives. Anytime you have issues with what the state is doing, the systemic racism, they go and paint you as a radical because they don't want to address what the system is doing to its own citizenry. This is what white conservatives do. I want to make that clear. And before they did it in Minneapolis, they did it in your community of Ferguson. They said that the young activists were mobs, hooligans. You were acting lawless. All the peaceful demonstrations in Ferguson, they didn't cover. They only covered the clashes with the police. After riot police started using tear gas, stun grenades, things that they're not supposed to use on their own citizenry. Now, was there looting in Ferguson. Absolutely. Absolutely. There were some young people who did looting. And you know, that should never be acceptable, what those individuals did. But you know what conservatives also don't talk about? The conditions that people were living in Ferguson. That should never be acceptable either. You can't run around saying that you're the richest and greatest nation on the planet Earth when people in Ferguson were barely having food in their refrigerator. And I'm not talking about one person in Ferguson. I'm talking about nearly a whole entire community of 20,000 people living in abject poverty for generations. This was what was happening in Ferguson. And Mike Brown was the last straw. It was the straw that broke the camel's back. Because people in Ferguson already knew that their government had neglected and forgot about them. They knew that their government was exploiting and occupying them. It was a largely majority white governance structure in Ferguson. Even though the vast majority of residents who lived in Ferguson were African American. So they felt they weren't getting any representation. They had no advocates. And a lot of that situation was due to electoral apathy. People in Ferguson had just given up. They weren't participating, they weren't voting. And therefore, outside people who didn't have the best interests of Ferguson in mind, the residents who lived in the community, were in charge of governing a community that they didn't give a shit about. And it showed. All they were there to do was squeeze every penny out of the residents of Ferguson. Every time this one person moved his car, he said he got a traffic ticket. They would boot your cars and leave tickets of $500 on your vehicle. This was a common occurrence in Ferguson. The residents would complain about it, but who would care? No one. So Ferguson, you were under occupation. You know, Ferguson, you can send a real strong message to the nation this year. That you haven't forgotten what happened to you. And that you're not going to put up with what happened to you. You want to know how you send that message, Ferguson? You come out in record numbers and you vote. You send the message to the Republican Party, who has been in control of Missouri, who hasn't done jack shit for you. You know Missouri is one of the most violent states in this nation. Missouri is one of the most violent states in this nation, and the Republican Party runs around talking about crime. Well, they control the governorship, they control the state senate, they control the state house, and 2 of the United States senators are Republicans. So in a state they completely control. Ask yourself, Ferguson, why is crime through the roof in Missouri? They're running around the nation telling us they can solve the problem of violence and crime in our communities. But in a state they solely control, they can't solve it there. You know, Ferguson, something's not adding up. Send them a message. Tell them you're done with their bullshit. You get out and you vote. Record numbers. If there's 20,000 people who live in Ferguson, 18 to 19,000 should vote. You vote for Trudy Bush Valentine. And you tell the Republican Party this. We're voting because we're tired of what's been happening. We're voting because we want representation. We're voting because we're citizens. And we're fed up with the neglect. Send them a message, Ferguson, that you have not forgotten what they did to your community. What they continue to try to do to your community. You know, a lot of young activists got involved with Black Lives Matter because of Mike Brown and what happened in Ferguson. People all across the nation watch with horror. And we know that there were instigators planted in the crowds. You had people like the Boogaloo Boys starting fires in the community, pretending that they were Black Lives Matter or Antifa, when really their sole intent was to get protesters who were peacefully, by and large, the vast majority of people who were protesting in Ferguson at every protest were peaceful. But you would have people like Boogaloo Boys pretend that they were Antifa, pretend that they were Black Lives Matter, set buildings on fire, throw things at the police, solely so the police could start doing what they did to the protesters in Ferguson. And then they would run off. In some cases, a lot of the people who were doing that were undercover police officers. Ferguson, I want you to understand this. They did a report, the FBI, and they said there were a lot of instances in Ferguson where there were undercover police officers who were instigating violence with the police for the sole purpose of the police to do violence towards the protesters. So they were undercover cops wearing street clothing. And they did this because they don't agree with wanting to root out racial injustice in our system. That's a fact, Ferguson. There are people in this country, lots of them, who don't want to root out racial injustice in our system. You saw it with Mark and Patricia McCloskey in St. Louis. You saw it with undercover cops in Ferguson. You saw it with conservative activists who spliced up and edited videos to create a narrative about the protesters in Minneapolis. All of those are instances of a larger narrative. And that larger narrative is this, Ferguson, that there are many Americans who are simply okay, thrilled in fact, the racial injustice continues to happen in our system, in our country. They don't want to have any discussion, debate concerning how to stop it. In fact, they want it to continue in perpetuity. Ferguson, you were under occupation for so long until Mike Brown happened. Really, the residents of Ferguson did not have a voice in their own entire state until they started screaming at the top of their lungs what was happening in their community. Mike Brown was not the first straw, it was the last straw. And conservatives can try to paint this narrative like, oh my goodness, I don't know why the people of Ferguson are so upset or so angry at their country. You can try to paint that narrative all you want, but don't expect people like myself to believe it. We know exactly why the residents of Ferguson were upset. The same reason American citizens were upset at the lunatic from Mar-a-Lago being president. Because they weren't being represented. In fact, they were being terrorized every day. Every day, the residents of Ferguson woke up to be terrorized by the state. A Republican-controlled state. That's what was happening in Ferguson. And Mike Brown was the last straw. The residents had had enough. And to the young activists of Ferguson, thank you for what you did. You really shined a light on the real issue in this country. And you sacrificed greatly. A lot of the Ferguson activists, a lot of them succumbed to injuries. A lot of them mysteriously were murdered. But it doesn't matter, Ferguson. What matters is you shone a light on what was happening in your community. What was happening all across America in communities mostly of color in this country. Neglect, lack of resources, racism, disrespect. That was what was happening in Ferguson. I was proud to go in person to Ferguson during the protests. We had a big protest in St. Louis and Ferguson. Thousands and thousands of people came from all across America. Because I knew then what they were saying was a lie. I knew then what they were trying to do was to say that the protesters, you had no right to protest peacefully your government. The state, what it was doing to you. I said no. The citizenry have a right to protest. Ferguson, I think you're going to make the difference this year. Nobody has forgotten about Mike Brown in Ferguson. Nobody has forgotten about all the activists that were lost in Ferguson due to standing up to racial injustice in this country. Ferguson, take care of business. Go out first day of early voting in Missouri and vote in record numbers. Send the racist Republicans a strong message in Missouri. One that they're not going to forget. Elect Trudy Bush Valentine. Take care of business, Ferguson. We love you. And thank you for standing up. You were one of the first communities in this country that stood up to entrench racial injustice. Ferguson, Missouri. I think when the story is written, they're going to say Ferguson. They turned out in record numbers. And see, that's what they're not expecting. They're expecting Ferguson to be lulled back asleep. But Ferguson, they've awoken the beast. Turn out, vote, take care of business, Ferguson. Let's win this.